Yeah. So all of this brings up very scary thoughts that I guess I'm still processing out loud. But as you were talking about Obergefell, it really occurred to me just how much of the conversation has been centered around trans rights rather than gay rights. And I know that we are talking about a lot of things. We're talking about reproductive rights in SB 8 here in Texas. We're talking about Don't Say Gay in Florida. But so much of the discourse seems to have moved from gay rights to trans rights. And we were kind of joking before the show and talking a little bit at the top about the Trans Day of Visibility and how, in a lot of ways, I think a lot of trans folks would say that life was easier 10, 20 years ago when there was less visibility, when they were less in the crosshairs. Can you tell us anything meaningful about the shift of focus from gay folks to trans folks, or why that narrative is getting ginned up in the way that it is?
Well, with regard to Trans Visibility Day, I mean, I have seen a few people say, I would love to not be so visible at this point. And I do get where that's coming from.
I'm still pro representation. I'm still like pro these ideas, but I feel that in my bones.
Because now we have targets on our back. But yeah, well, trans rights are not as well established as gay rights at this point, which is not to say that they're perfectly well established everywhere in the United States with our weird patchwork of federalism and sometimes just outright not actually enforcing the laws and constitutional protections in various places. But yeah, trans rights is, I think, seen as an area where they can still contest, and for those who need it, can have a degree of plausible deniability over being bigots. Moral panics often operate around this notion of saving the kids, right? And here's another connection between anti-abortion legislation and anti-trans legislation that targets youth. You're having, these authoritarians who want to police people's gender and sexuality and make these arguments that, we're protecting kids, we're saving babies, whatever. That sort of thing works for them, though it very much tends to be projection. I mean, how did we get this whole discourse about child abuse and about, age-appropriate, gender-affirming care, which, let's be clear here, for kids before adolescence, that generally means just access to counseling and social transition if they want to, just the ability to do what they want with their hair and their clothes and have their parents support and change their pronouns or their name if they want to, so that there's plenty of time to establish, whether you do have a case of just gender nonconformity and someone decides that they're cisgender after all and they can be cis and different, and that's great. Or if you really have a case of gender dysphoria, a diagnosis that, in fact, medical practitioners are somewhat reluctant to give out. It is not super easy to get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So there's no one like rushing to give this diagnosis out to kids, right? But so there's plenty of time to distinguish between those two things, and they are different things. And then if you have a kid who clearly has gender dysphoria and it's persistent over a number of years, and that kid is entering adolescence, then maybe puberty blockers enter the picture. They are safe. They are prescribed for a number of conditions. They are not experimental. And they're not irreversible, right? So we're not making irreversible changes. And after that, and typically not until the kid is no longer a minor, then we talk about hormones and possibly surgeries and things that could make permanent changes. Although even hormonal changes are to a large extent reversible, especially when you're not too far along with them. So all of the concerns about this are, disingenuous or simply not based in facts. I mean, I suppose they can be sincere, but not based in facts. But what you have is this rhetoric of people wanting to save children, right? And so how did this happen in Texas? I mean, there's this guy, Jeffrey Younger, who's now running for the Texas State House, right? Who was involved in a custody battle with his ex-wife, who is a pediatrician, and was allowing their child to socially transition in line with medical best practices as established by wide consensus, when the child was staying with her. And so he tried to, he basically abused the system and accused her of child abuse for that, right? It was an abusive thing for him to do. And flipping things on their head like that is often how abusers operate, and it's how authoritarian states and authoritarian communities operate as well. So they take something that, you know, is actually something that certain kids really need, right, to feel happy and whole and themselves, and say that allowing the kids to do that is abusive and they are saving the children. But as long as you're saving the children, you know, you'll get a hearing. And there are some on the left who are willing to join them in this as well. We talk sometimes about TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, and they have a very strong foothold in Britain and are taken seriously in the British media, even the BBC, you know, in a way that the trans community itself is not. And so there have been some who have been working to separate the LGB from the T, and basically being willing to throw trans people to the wolves. It is another reason that trans people make for a more vulnerable target at this point. I don't think there's necessarily anything that's really that much harder to understand what it means to be transgender than to understand what it means to be gay or bisexual. But some people seem to have a real issue with that. And I mean, I think in most cases, it's more personal hangups probably than really a lack of ability to understand it. But yeah. It's easy still to push that trope that, oh, not enough is known, it's experimental. We can't allow kids to make permanent changes that they might regret later. They'll always trot out a few detransitioners and say, look, you know, these are living cautionary tales. We don't want kids to end up like this. The vast majority of people who actually do move on to hormonal transition never regret it, feel better, and don't want to go back. But, you know, doctors aren't pushing this on people. When I first went and asked for hormones, you know, I wasn't able to get them right away. And the doctor made sure that this was a real and persistent thing that I was having, and also made sure to tell me, you know, you need to know that. And so first we're going to try just a very low dose, not even a therapeutic dose. And if you don't, you know, if you want to stop at any time, you can stop. Doctors aren't just out there pushing this on people, but you've got people on both the right and the far crazy left, but mostly on the right, you know, claiming that there are these evil doctors out there and psychologists and therapists and school teachers who just want to make all the kids trans. In fact, I saw the weirdest conspiracy theory on Twitter today. God. It was getting some traction. This guy claimed that the reason that the left is pushing kids to be trans, which we're not, by the way, nobody does that. That's not a thing.
That's not a thing.
But, you know, is pushing kids to be queer. It's part of a two-step process, he says, in making kids into revolutionaries, right? So first, you teach them CRT so the white kids feel bad about themselves, because now they've learned that they are oppressors and no, there's nothing they can do about that. They're just bad because they're white. But then you teach them about sexuality and gender, and then they learn, oh, if I just say I'm non-binary, now I can be oppressed again and have all the wonderful status that comes to you when you get to claim an oppressed status. So I mean, that's just bonkers.
Yeah. First of all, the numbers just don't add up in any meaningful way. Like, the number of trans folks that exist are important because they're human beings, but in terms of voting blocks, not a thing. And I'm a gender and sexuality therapist. You know, as much as anybody is, I am working with and working to support these folks. And I cannot get doctors to take my phone calls. You know, I meet with somebody for an hour every single week for month after month, and a doctor meets with them for 15 minutes and doesn't want to hear anything that I have to say, when what I'm trying to say is that this is somebody who may be getting some value out of hormone replacement therapies. These things are incredibly challenging to get. There is a lot of red tape and a lot of reticence on the part of prescribers because of all of the political pressure. The idea that doctors are going out of their way to like shove these things down people's throats is just absolutely asinine. I have seen zero examples of that.
And, you know, I mean, it's really, I think, the same sort of phenomenon as you probably got this sort of thing in Christian school too, where sometimes when, you know, Christians are talking about evolutionists or secular scientists, they're like, you know, the only reason they don't believe in God, which also, by the way, lots of people do believe in God and evolution. Like, you can also do that.
Sure.
Like Francis Collins is actually an evangelical Human Genome Project dude. But anyway, the reason they don't believe in God and they're trying to teach us about evolution is because they just want to sin all the time, right? So they just want to be queer or just have all the sex or just do all the drugs. And so they make everything into a conspiracy theory like this, right? There's only one reason people wouldn't be exactly like us, and it's because they're evil, you know?
Yeah, it really is exhausting. But at the same time, this quote unquote culture war is not about winning and losing. I mean, people are hurting and dying because of these practices, because of these policies. And so I guess I'm hearing from you a fair amount of doom and gloom. And it makes me kind of curious what your worst case scenario might entail.
Worst case scenario, I mean, is large scale violence, genocide. It's not impossible because we've gone pretty far down the road of dehumanization already, right? And one form of genocide is taking children of the targeted group away from their parents. And you know, people have talked about how the sports bans that are passing widely. The parents that I talked to in Texas, they also talked about the trans school sports ban that was passed last year as kind of a gateway law, planting certain ideas in people's minds that, oh, these trans girls, they're just boys who want to dominate girls on the playing field, which is not how sports works or gender or anything.
Or any of those things. That's not what any of those words mean. And yet.
Or, you know, or with the bathroom bills, right? Just these are men in dresses who want to be predators. Queer people continue, this is a long-standing trope, continue to be represented as predators and pedophiles, right? It's, again, it's that externalization because sexual abuse tends to usually happen close to home, right? With trusted authority figures, family members, close family friends, clergy.
Particularly in authoritarian environments.
Right. Abuse thrives there because it will be covered up. You know, as long as it's done by someone who has a high enough place in the social hierarchy, it will be covered up. So abuse thrives in those kinds of circumstances. They know there's a monster in themselves and in their communities that they don't want to look at. And so instead they just look and see a monster somewhere else, and they choose to see it in queer people. So scapegoating is a major mechanism that is in play there. But yeah, these dynamics can really ramp up and escalate. This new policy that, again, it isn't even a law. It didn't even pass the legislature. It's just a radical executive reinterpretation of Texas child abuse law in Texas represents a major escalation. If it is allowed to stand, you know, I can certainly see the conversation on adoption, for example, moving from, well, we just need to protect the right of, you know, religious adoption organizations to only adopt a straight Christian couples to, well, maybe queer, maybe, you know, people in same-sex marriages shouldn't be allowed to adopt kids at all, to maybe we should take their kids away because clearly they're not being raised right, you know, and we've done it before. Right. This is why we have something called the Indian Child Welfare Act that was passed in the 1970s, because lots and lots of Native children were being taken illegitimately from their families, ripped away, sent to residential schools where they suffered violence and abusive treatment in Canada and the United States. So they could be, quote, civilized. Yes. Yeah. Right. So you could, quote, kill the Indian and save the man. This isn't actually something that is just fiction, right? This has happened, and it can happen again, targeting a different demographic. So, I mean, I think things can get very, very bad. I hope they don't, but I think they can. And we need to think about that.
Yeah, no, it's fair to say. Maybe I am just 30 enough to be nervous now, but for so much of my life, I've been the type of humanist that really believes that the overarching theme, even if there are some backward steps, that we are ultimately heading towards, if not true utopia, then something slightly better than what we found. And the longer I spend in front of this microphone, the more time I spend around these issues, the more I'm shaking in my boots, and the more I'm feeling a little bit anxious and overwhelmed. I definitely don't mean to make any of this conversation about you or I or the mantles that we carry, but we were kind of talking before the show. This has just been a tough time to be a person, and to show up for a show like this has been a little bit extra exhausting, when the research that you're going through just makes it that much harder to like drink a beer and watch TV, which is I think what we are all kind of wanting to do right now with the way our economy and everything else is. But before I start to like descend into existential angst, let's jump on the calls one more time and talk to our friend Stephanie, who I think has a number of questions about this issue. Stephanie, what's on your mind tonight? All right. Well, let's return to the conversation. We'll get that straightened out. What do you see as our opportunities here? What are the levers and the pulleys that we actually have access to? Because the voting box seems to be a small part of it, if at all. I mean, where do you find hope?
Well, state and local battles matter quite a bit at this point, because this is sort of happening in a patchwork. And, and let's say that politically the worst case, the electoral worst case scenario plays out. Republicans retake the legislature in the midterms and then retake the presidency in 2024. I still think that for a good while, states will be able to set policies different from the federal government on some of these issues. We'll be able to be more protective of human rights, more genuinely democratic and inclusive. So state battles are something that people can participate in.
Local politics matter.
Local politics absolutely matters, and people can get involved with school board, with local non-discrimination ordinances, hearings, meetings. You can possibly do something, find something to get involved in. Other than that, I think getting people's stories out there and representation still matter. And so that's why trans day visibility, I think, is still ultimately a good thing. And people who want to be allies and aren't trans or queer themselves can try to help get the voices of trans people out there, so that people do understand more. And I suppose everyone can make a commitment just to get a little more educated about this, right? So that you can help trans people from, not having to explain everything to everyone again and again and again every time, right? You can help to educate the wider public as well if you get educated yourself on trans issues. But yeah, I think narratives, stories matter. They help change people's minds, hearts and minds. And so conversation by conversation, that's still important.
Yeah. Which, not to be even more doom and gloom about it, but to circle back to what you were saying about the bills around sport, that is for me why those ideas are so insidious. Because now I have gone from somebody who is able to advocate for a queer teen and speak to their parents and say, hey, I don't know exactly who your child is or who they will become. They don't know who they are entirely or who they will become. But everything that we're doing is within the range of good practice. And here is some literature. Here are some statistics. And now that conversation is being couched by whatever the hell Ron DeSantis or Ted Cruz or Marjorie Taylor Greene has to say on the subject. And so that visibility, or that notion that there's something less than right about all of this is incredibly frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Are there any particular organizations that you might be able to point us towards? Anything that might help us to get a little bit of traction here?
Well, for helping trans youth and trans folks in legal battles, Lambda Legal is a great national organization to support, and helping fight against trans youth suicide, the Trevor Project. But I would also encourage people to look to whatever local organizations are fighting those battles in your state, and probably know more what's needed on the ground in your state. The parents that I was talking to for my recent reporting in Texas talked about this organization called TENT, which, of course, off the top of my head now, there it is, Transgender Education Network of Texas. I had to look it up again, but they said that's a state organization that's doing great things, putting out guides, for example, about what to do if CPS does come knocking on your door because you have a trans kid or are suspected of having a trans kid that you might be allowing to get appropriate medical care. So yeah, look for local organizations too, just wherever you happen to be. And I've heard some rousing endorsements of TENT from Texan parents of trans kids that I spoke with recently.
Yeah, I saw that in some of your reporting you talked to the Briggle family, and they've become sort of local advocates for a number of organizations and have definitely been on my radar. And so I might even point people towards Amber Briggle on Instagram and on Facebook and some of these things. And there will certainly be links to Tent and to everything that we've been talking about in the show notes for this episode.